Hello everybody and welcome to Charts with Dan. It's a good thing that I decided to split streaming charts off into a separate show, which it is this week, because we have so much to talk about with the Super Mario Brothers movie. It went absolutely bananas, which is kind of appropriate for a movie that includes Donkey Kong as one of its main characters. So many different records falling left and right and different marks that are being set. There's so many different things here that I didn't really have time to even adjust for inflation this week. And if I don't have time to adjust for inflation, you know that I've got a lot to talk about, so let's get to it. Very quickly though, before we do, I just want to remind people, go down to the description below. You'll find a couple of links there for tornado relief here in Arkansas. It's been a little over a week since Central Arkansas was hit with a devastating tornado. It basically just cut a path through my hometown. There are thousands of people in need, thousands of homes destroyed, and homes that don't have roofs. I did a little bit of volunteer work last week. I haven't been able to do nearly as much as I'd like to, but the scope of the devastation here is really hard to convey. And, you know, time moves on, headlines move on, and I think people tend to forget about these things, but there are going to be a lot of people here that are in need for a long time. So please check out those links down in the description below, and I'm trying to work on some other options to provide even more support through the channel. So thank you in advance for checking that out. And let's look at the box office charts for this last weekend. The structure is going to be a little bit different this week. I'm working with some things because I changed the way the show is ordered with streaming being split off. So I hope you like it. Let me know down in the comments below if you don't. I'm sure you will. Let's look first at the top 10 domestically for this past weekend, April 7th through the 9th, and the Super Mario Brothers movie making $146.3 million over that 3-day weekend, which would be impressive in its own right, but keep in mind that the movie opened on Wednesday, so it had 2 full days to make money. That's not counted here in this weekend total. We'll look at the full 5-day total for the film. So that's just Friday through Sunday, release days 3, 4, and 5. In a distant second place, as you would imagine, is John Wick Chapter 4, which dropped off 49% in its third week for a $14.4 million total. It was pretty much a statistical tie between second place and third place because Air only lost out on that second place spot by about $10,000 out of $14.4 million. Air is another movie that opened on Wednesday. It did about $20 million over its 5-day opening weekend, which is kind of like Dungeons and Dragons that we talked about last week. It's good news, bad news. That's good for an R-rated adult skewing film, that it was in a very competitive marketplace, that it was able to open to about $20 million over that 5-day span. The bad news is that the movie had a budget of about $90 million plus really hefty acquisition costs that Amazon put into it. So even though Air did well for a movie of its type, it is unlikely to make money in that theatrical window, although I don't really know if that's what Amazon intended. I do applaud them putting it out into theaters nationwide, putting a big promotional push behind it, and actually reporting the box office grosses. I hope that more streamers follow their lead in many ways. So it was a good performance for Air, just not great when you look at the money that's already been invested in it. And as I mentioned, that's also the case with Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. After a solid debut, given what the expectations were last week, the hope for Dungeons and Dragons, really its only hope to make money purely based on theatrical exhibition, was to hold well against the competition, especially Super Mario Brothers in its second weekend. It did not do that. It dropped about 62.7% in its second week with a $13.8 million total. 62.7% would be a fairly steep drop-off for a movie that had opened to $150, $160 million to a movie that opened at around $40 million. That's not good, and it doesn't really bode very well for its future box office prospects, and we'll look at those in just a few minutes. In fifth place was Scream 6, which is actually holding pretty well week over week, a 35.8% drop and a $3.4 million total. In sixth place was the religious-themed film His Only Son, dropping 49% in week 2 for a $2.8 million total. Creed 3 in seventh place dropped 44.9% in week 6 for a total just over $2.7 million. Shazam! Fury of the Gods in week 4 in serious danger and probably will be falling out of the top 10 next week weekend. We're actually at like $750,000, and they came in almost $200,000 lower than that. So those are some bad estimates that were sent in by the studio yesterday. I was really anxious to see this movie. I didn't see it, largely because the reviews weren't strong. I do plan to see it fairly soon, but this is one that seemed to have a little bit of buzz when it was coming out. Didn't really deliver in the long run. And when we look at what I like to call the road to recovery, so this is this past weekend's box office versus The Hedgehog 2, which set the record for the highest video game opening to date. That opening record was just shattered, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But Sonic the Hedgehog Mario Brothers movie, which really blew all of that away. So let's look at some of the marks that were set by the Super Mario Brothers movie this past weekend, and it was John Wick Chapter 4 and Creed 3. However, if the Super Mario Brothers movie holds well, and I anticipate that it probably will over the next weekend, then we will probably have two of the highest grossing weekends of 2023 when you divorce it from whether. Beyond that, it really just depends on how this movie does in the weeks ahead. There's certainly nothing that we've seen in the last few days that says to me that this movie is going to do anything but continue to perform phenomenally. Thieves also did not hold well internationally. It drops to number 3 with 15.5 million. The Pope's Exorcist, starring Russell Crowe, which opens domestically than Ant-Man and the Wasp did. So we are now seeing the animated video game movie. Steam has a new genre kicked open the door here. Are we going to see this Nintendo expanded universe? Are we going to see other studios snapping up video game properties and trying to do the same thing? Video game filmmaking, as decades of experience have shown us, is very risky. So I don't really know if there's going to be a lot of studios getting in on this game, but it certainly looks like, not even looks like, the evidence is there in the box office numbers that Nintendo and Illumination have really caught something big here. You see there Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, now the second highest 3-day opening weekend worldwide at 227.4 million, followed by John Wick Chapter 4's 137.8 million, Creed 3's 100.3 million, and Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves at number 5 with 70.2 million. And when you expand it to overall weekend grosses, whether a movie was opening or not, the Super Mario Brothers movie still number 1 with $319.1 million, followed by the opening weekend of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Then we had the fourth weekend of Avatar: The Way of Water. It put up $178.4 million on the first weekend of the new year, January 6, 2023. Full River Red from China's at number 4 with $144.3 million in its second week of release on January 31st. And then John Wick Chapter 4 is at number 5 in its opening week with $137.8 million. So as I mentioned, the Super Mario Brothers movie set all kinds of marks, broke records, went into top 5s. This is just a sampling of some of the entries in the record book that we saw rewritten this past weekend with the Super Mario Brothers movie. And this is really just domestic. We're not even looking at the stuff internationally and worldwide. First of all, the movie put up the best 5-day opening weekend domestically of all time. Now, what does that 5-day opening weekend mean? That doesn't mean the first 5 days of release, because movies like Avengers Endgame and Spider-Man No Way Home are much, much higher. This is basically any movie that opened on a Wednesday, and so its opening weekend is counted as Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday opening weekend. Transformers: Dark of the Moon is at number 3 with $162.6 million, followed by Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, which opened back in July of 2009 at $158 million. And then the Twilight Saga, its 5-day opening weekend. Now, the thing that's really impressive to me, even though this is not adjusted for inflation, is that all of those other films opened in June and July, which meant that there was no school. All the kids were out and they were all going to see this film. So this just kind of goes to show you the power that the Super Mario Brothers movie had this week. It was playing like a summer blockbuster in the middle of spring. Looking at the numbers for Illumination, even though it opened on Wednesday, the Super Mario Brothers movie also set the mark for Illumination 3-day opening weekends, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, at $146.3 million. That beats out Minions, which previously held the mark with $115.3 million, and Despicable Me 2, another Illumination film that opened on Wednesday and so had its opening 3-day weekend gross depressed a little bit at $84.2 million. It would be much higher on this list, I think, if it had opened on Friday. Looking at Illumination grosses through 5 days, Super Mario Bros. Still has the top spot, $204.6 million in its first 5-day stretch, which was Wednesday through Sunday. Minions is lagging pretty far behind, $145.5 million through its first 5 days, which was a Friday through Tuesday run. The only other five with $140.6 million, and The Secret Life of Pets with $131.1 million. So opening for a video game movie of all time. Well, the Super Mario Bros. Movie came in and said $6.3 million, over twice the amount that Sonic the Hedgehog 2 put up a year ago, with a very now quaint-looking $72.1 million. Then we have the Super Mario Bros. Movie, $146.3 million over its first Friday, Saturday, Sunday span. Finding Dory's at number 3 at just over $135 million. That was a traditional Friday through Sunday opening. Frozen 2 is at number 4 with $130.2 million. Let's look at April first weekend grosses, which is owned by Avengers Endgame, which opened back on April 26, 2018. It put up a $147.1 million opening weekend, but right behind is the Super Mario Bros. Movie with its Friday, Saturday, Sunday gross of $146.3 million. And in 5th place is 2016's The Jungle Book from of these slots, and they're both having a really great year at the box office this year. These are the top 5 first weekend grosses for films rated PG. Disney's The Lion King is at number 1 back in 2019. Mario Bros. Movie, the only one of these 5 that opened on a Wednesday, still up there in the top 5, $108 million in its first 3 days. That was a Universal record and still is a Universal record. Jurassic World movie put up grosses nearly as good as these other Universal films, save for Jurassic World openings. I know I sound like a broken record, but this really just does underscore how impressive this opening weekend was. We have a lot more to get to on a very packed show, but before we do, I want to thank one of the sponsors for this week, Athletic Greens, the makers of AG1. AG1 has been featured on the show for a while, and it's because it's become part of my, I feel like uncovering my nutritional basis and just starting my day off right. Things that it needs, and AG1 was designed to help you live easier and better without having to change a whole lot of what you already do. It's just 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day, and it makes it easy to live your best life. Each scoop of AG1 is packed with /Dan, that's athleticgreens.com/Dan, to check it out. So just how much money is the Super Mario Bros. Movie making? Well, here's my best estimate. First, you have to look at what the movie costs. The budget has been reported to be about $100 million, which is pretty cheap for animation. It's an ads budget of $125 million, which, yes, is higher than the budget of the film, but for a movie of this size, is actually pretty reasonable. It could be even higher. We could be looking at a spend closer to $150 million, but I'm putting the costs at the Super Mario Bros. Movie at an estimated $225 million. So how much money is it bringing in? Well, first of all, you have to look at China. The movie's actually not doing well in China at all. $6.3 million over this opening weekend. It just continues a trend that we've seen where films from US studios, largely except for Avatar and maybe 1 or 2 others, just are not getting any traction in the Chinese market. Now, there are some outstanding international markets that may help to offset this underperformance in China, the biggest one being Japan. The Super Mario Bros. Movie has not yet opened in Japan, and as you can imagine, the Nintendo movie may hold just a little bit of interest to moviegoers in Japan, the home of Nintendo. So there's still a lot of money on the table for the Super Mario Bros. Movie that's not included in this estimate. But when we look at the international box office for the markets where it is open, the movie's brought in about $166.7 million in those other international markets, and the investors get back a 40% share of that with $66.6 million. Now, you notice here I keep saying that the movie goes back to the investors because people pointed out, and I think pretty reasonably, that it's not always just a studio that bankrolls a movie. For example, last week I was talking about Dungeons and Dragons and saying the movie was going back to the studio, and many of you pointed out, rightfully so, that Hasbro put up some of the budget for the film. So it's not all going back just to Paramount, it's also going back to Hasbro. So that's why I'm saying the investor cut, whomever they may be, Illumination, Universal, Nintendo, however they're splitting these revenues. So we have 20% of that China gross going back to the investors. That comes out to about $1.2 million so far. 40% of the international gross, that comes out to about $66.6 million so far. And then I'm giving the investors a 60% share of the opening weekend box office that seems seems to be about industry standard. That opening weekend box office, just over $204.6 million. That means that $122.7 million is going back to investors. So when you add up all of those shares after 5 days of release, I have a rough estimate of about $190.7 million already coming back to investors from the first weekend of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. When you look at that versus the costs, that means that they just need another $34.2 million coming in profit to recoup their investment for the Super Mario Bros. Movie purely in the theatrical window. And honestly, they probably made that money back today. And the reason that I also want to make the distinction of making the money back purely in the theatrical window is that this does not include other revenue streams. Obviously, there is a lot of merchandising from this movie. Merchandising money that is going to go to the different people that put up the money to make the movie. And of course, you have home video and revenue and streaming stuff that's going to come after this theatrical window. When I'm doing these estimates, this is really all about how much money is coming in purely from theatrical release. And that really kind of indicates how much money has to come in from other revenue streams. So I just want to make it clear, I am not accounting for all revenue here. This is purely box office revenue, but it seems like there could be a lot more of that box office revenue out there, because if you look down in the left-hand corner, if you give the Super Mario Bros. Movie a performance similar to Minions 2, which would be domestic legs of about 3.45x, which means that the final gross will be about 3.45 times its domestic opening weekend, and international legs of about 4 times its opening weekend, the investor share just from that, if it performs like Minions 2, is about $579.7 million. If you add that to what they've already brought in, you offset that versus the costs, that brings in a net profit to the investors purely from the theatrical window of over $350 million, not counting everything else and all the interest that's generated from Mario and Universal selling theme park tickets to all of their Mario lands and Nintendo selling games. This movie, let's be honest here, is a cash cow. This movie is going to print money for the people that invested in it. And so the question now becomes, how are they going to spend that capital? Are we going to see a big expanded Nintendo animated universe? Are they going to play it small, protect those profits? We don't really know. And I think because Nintendo is involved here and it's not just a studio, then maybe they're not going to go the way that we think they all will. But this is going to be a money machine for the next few weeks. And it's going to be really fun and interesting to track it here on the show. How does that compare to another less fortunate film that we were just talking about, Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, which may very well have lost a lot of money to Super Mario Bros. At the box office. Last week, I put together a very similar sheet about how much money it needs in order to approach a break-even point. Well, unfortunately, with its performance this past weekend, this is really becoming much more about how much money is the Dungeons & Dragons movie losing. And I made a couple of mathematical errors last week that I've corrected this week. So let's take an updated look. How much money could the Dungeons & Dragons movie be losing theatrically, given these same market estimates? Well, it's not doing great in China. It's only brought in about $9.6 million. That translates to an investor cut of around $1.9 million. Internationally, it's brought in about $52.1 million if you take out that Chinese gross. That's a return to investors of about $20.8 million. A 60% share of its first week gross of $37.2 million brings about $22.3 million back to investors. And then a 55% share of weekend 2, which is assuming that the studios are giving a little bit back to the movie theaters, brings in a investor cut of about $13.4 million. So when you put that up against the costs of the movie, a budget of $150 million, a prints and ads budget of around $100 million, which may even be a little bit on the low side, that gives us costs of about $250 million. When you calculate that versus the income that I've estimated of about $58.5 million when you add everything together, that means that right now the Dungeons & Dragons movie, in my estimates, has a profit shortfall of $191.4 million, which means that this movie is likely going to lose $100+ million at the box office just based on theatrical receipts. And so now the metric of success moves away from box office to what are the merchandising sales? Are they selling any more Dungeons and Dragons games? Are they selling things that are branded with this film? Are they seeing good buzz? Do they see subscribers to Paramount Plus or wherever they're going to stream the movie after the theatrical window? I loved Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves, but its success is not going to be determined based off of its theatrical receipts, because based just on that, it is a pretty big failure. However, you have to now go beyond that, and then it gets off the books. It goes beyond my purview. I'm kind of like Gandalf. It has passed beyond my sight at this point, and it all becomes about studio accounting. Maybe there's enough goodwill. Maybe it makes enough in other ancillary revenue streams that they decide to do more of these movies, but probably not at this budget point. $150 million was a lot to invest in a Dungeons & Dragons movie, and I think that you saw that money on screen, but it's not smart money because it's not really coming back on the box office side. Let's hope it comes back elsewhere, because I really like this movie, and I don't want to discourage studios from making movies like it. You just don't see that support there. It's too competitive. They were able to turn people out the first weekend, but there's obviously not a huge audience for this movie out there in the theatrical marketplace right now. They're going to have to discover this movie later on, or maybe not at all. It is sad because it is a movie that I really, really liked. It's just not doing the business right now to justify the money spent theatrically. There are a few other franchises that we've been tracking, and I want to make sure that they don't get lost in the shuffle here. The first one is the Scream franchise. I mentioned that Scream 6 is holding pretty well in its subsequent weekends. Well, it actually just bypassed the original Scream made in 1996, unadjusted for inflation, to become the highest grossing film in the Scream franchise. So when you look in the record books, 2023 Scream 6 will now be listed as the highest grossing Scream film ever released. Of course, it is substantially below the first three Scream films when you do adjust for inflation, but it will be holding that #1 spot. It becomes just the third film in the Scream franchise to pass that $100 million mark. So it's there at #1, much like Creed 3 is there at #1 in the Rocky franchise when you don't adjust for inflation. One movie that's not anywhere near #1 in its franchise is Shazam! Fury of the Gods. The bottom continues to fall out of that film. I think it's already hitting streaming this week or next week. They've pretty much given up on the theatrical model for this one because, well, there's really not much there. And when you look at the franchise tracker for the DCEU, these are empty victories, really. It has bypassed the gross of the Suicide Squad, so now Shazam! Fury of the Gods is the 10th lowest grossing movie in the DCEU. It's not even going to sniff the domestic total of Birds of Prey at $84.1 million. So it basically just barely beat two films that were available day and date on HBO Max during a time where theaters were still heavily recovering from the pandemic. And when you look at the DCEU by domestic gross adjusted, Fury of the Gods can't even get up to that #1 spot. It's still lagging behind the Suicide Squad and likely will. It'll go down as the 11th highest grossing film, just over Wonder Woman 1984, which again was really in the middle of the pandemic. So yeah, there's no good news for Shazam! Fury of the Gods. It lost a lot of money. It has not picked up any goodwill theatrically. Maybe it'll be popular on streaming, but yeah, I can't shine that penny up. It's bad. It's just not, it's not good news. Let's take a look at the per theater averages for the domestic box office for this past weekend. Of course, #1 is the Super Mario Brothers movie. It brought in $33,701 in each of its 4,343 theaters. Congratulations, theater owners. Your great spring continues. At #2 is the film Joyland, which brought in $20,638 in just one theater. Joyland is from Pakistani director Saeem Sadiq. It premiered at Cannes last year. It's about a man who falls in love with a transgender woman. The film was originally banned in Pakistan due to its subject matter and still is in parts of the country. So a lot of interest here domestically for that film in the very small marketplace. It's just one theater. At #3 is Kelly Reichardt's new film, Showing Up. First Cow was a big buzz movie for her. This also did well in limited release in just 4 theaters, $16,733 per theater. Playing in 12 theaters was the buzzy festival hit How to Blow Up a Pipeline, bringing in $9,621 per theater. And rounding out the top 5, again in just one theater, is a re-release of the 2003 documentary My Architect, bringing bringing in $4,832 in that one theater. This was an Oscar-nominated documentary about the architect Louis Kahn, made by his son Nathaniel Kahn. And the Super Mario Bros. Movie set another mark this past weekend because the $33,701 per theater average was the best per theater average for any film this year so far. It easily beat Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which brought in $24,421 in 2 more theaters back in February. The Wandering Earth 2 is at number 3. It brought in $21,173 per theater in 142 theaters back in January. Joyland comes in at number 4 on the list with $20,638 in its one theater. And then John Wick Chapter 4 is in 5th place. It brought in $19,149 per theater in each of its 3,855 theaters back in March. Looking at the top 5 films in limited release, these are movies in 1,000 theaters or fewer. The Sundance winner, 1001, stays at the top of this chart with just under $600,000 in 926 theaters. Paint in 819 theaters is at number 2 at just over $570,000. At number 3 is La Usurpadora the Musical, which played in 313 theaters and brought in a total of $140,000. This is a musical adaptation of a very popular 90s Mexican telenovela, so there was some interest for this on the limited release circuit. How to Blow Up a Pipeline brought in just over $115,000 total in its 12 theaters. And then in 5th place, shedding a lot of theaters, but still good enough for number 5, is Zach Braff's A Good Person, which brought in $111,000, still playing in 337 theaters. When we look at the top grossing films in limited release this year, Pathaan is number 1 still with $17.4 million. A Man Called Otto's at number 2, bringing in $6.2 million while it was still playing in limited release this year. This is all tickets sold, by the way, no matter when the movie was officially released. Women Talking's at number 3 with $5.3 million, followed by The Wandering Earth 2 at just over $5 million. Number 5 is interesting here because this is a Spanish animated film called Mummies, which was actually released back in February, but apparently Warner did not report those grosses until this past week. So it's actually been there earning money. We just didn't know it. It's good enough for number 5 with $4.2 million. The Whale gets bumped down 1 spot to number 6, $3.9 million, playing in limited release prior to its wide expansion. The 2023 Oscar shorts moved down 1 spot to number 7. Living moves down 1 spot to number 8. 1001 enters the chart with $2.9 million at number 9. Tujuthi Main Makar is at number 10 with its $2.5 million gross, down 2 spots from last week. And we have 2 films that dropped out of the overall top 10, Walter Viraya and Fear. We'll keep chugging along with these charts in just a moment, but before we do, I want to thank the other sponsor for this week, Stamps.com. And you know, everybody needs a team to achieve anything. I know that Mara is an invaluable part of my team, and she actually does handle a lot of sending stuff out when I need it. With Stamps.com, a post office is in your office. All you need is a computer and a printer. They even send you a scale so that you'll have everything you need to get started. And if you need a package picked up, you can easily schedule it through Stamps.com. If you sell products online, it also seamlessly connects with every major marketplace and shopping cart. Running a business isn't cheap, especially when it comes to fulfilling orders for customers. Luckily, Stamps.com has huge carrier discounts, including up to 84% off USPS and UPS rates, and it automatically tells you your cheapest and fastest shipping options. Stamps.com's been an indispensable partner for over 1 million business for over 2 decades, and you can get access to the USPS and UPS services you need right from your computer anytime, day or night. No lines, no traffic, and no waiting. Set your business up for success when you get started with Stamps.com today. Sign up with promo code MERLL, that's MURRELL, for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a free digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, and enter code MERLL. Looking at the 2023 domestic winter-spring box office, which is basically all movies released in calendar year 2023. For now, really, again, as I'm sitting here, the Super Mario Bros. Movie has surpassed it, but Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, enjoying its last moments, is the highest-grossing film of 2023. The Super Mario Bros. Movie is at number 2 with $204.6 million, about $8 million behind Ant-Man and the Wasp. Creed 3 drops down 1 spot to number 3 with $153.2 million total, followed by John Wick Chapter 4 at $146.9 million. I think it's likely to pass Creed 3 probably this week. Scream 6 drops down one spot to number 5, followed by Megan at number 6, Cocaine Bear at number 7. Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves is up to $61.6 million total, and it moves up 2 spots from last week. Shazam! Fury of the Gods drops down 2 spots to number 9, and Jesus Revolution drops down 2 spots to number 10. 80 for Brady dropping out of the overall winter-spring top 10. When we look at the domestic box office by calendar gross, so this is all tickets sold no matter when the movie was released, for now, again, Avatar: The Way of Water remains the highest grossing film of calendar year 2023, but the Super Mario Bros. Movie will bump it down to number 2 this week, so it's going to bypass the tickets sold this year for Avatar: The Way of Water. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is at number 2, the Super Mario Bros. Movie is at number 3, Creed 3 moves down 1 spot to number 4, John Wick Chapter 4 stays at number 5, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish gets bumped out of the top 5 to number 6, Scream 6 is at number 7, Megan is at number 8, A Man Called Otto is at number 9, and Cocaine Bear is at number 10. Dropping out of the top 10 after one sad week is Shazam! Fury of the Gods, which had its 1 week of glory and now is cast back down to Hades. Looking at the worldwide box office for 2023, Full River Red is the highest grossing film of 2023 for at least probably 2 or 3 more weeks. $673.5 million, followed by The Wandering Earth 2 with $603.9 million. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania's days are numbered at that number 3 spot, $473.4 million total. It is not even going to crack the $500 million mark when we look at worldwide box office. Usually most movies would be happy to make $473.4 million, but when you cost $200 million before prints and advertising, that's not so great. The Super Mario Bros. Movie enters the chart at number 4 with $377.6 million worldwide. That's inclusive of every day of its release. That is a really good number. Creed 3 drops down 1 spot to number 5 with $269.4 million total. John Wick Chapter 4 drops down to number 6. Boonie Bear's Guardian Code drops down to number 7. Megan is down 1 spot to number 8. Scream 6 is down 1 spot to number 9. And the Chinese film Hidden Blade is down 1 spot to number 10. Dropping off of the top 10 is another Chinese film, Deep Sea. Before we wrap things up with our box office flashback, I wanted to take a few minutes to recognize some people that passed away in the last several days that had huge impacts on the world of film, particularly in various different ways. The first is actor Michael Lerner, who is one of those that guy actors. He's been in so many movies that you've probably seen, and you probably also recognize his face. He was really memorable in every role that he took on. He was an Oscar-nominated actor for Best Supporting Actor in Barton Fink, directed by the Coen brothers. Michael Lerner built a career largely on television before appearing in films like Barton Fink, as well as Newsies, Blank Check, 1998's Godzilla as Mayor Ebert, a not-so-subtle jab at the critic Roger Ebert. He also played the cranky boss in Elf and appeared in the Coens' A Serious Man, as well as a regular role on the TV version of Clueless. This was always an actor who I liked to see pop up in a movie, and I was very sad to see he passed away. And then we had several people in the crafts area of film and television and pop culture, really, that I wanted to recognize. The first is Al Jaffe, who, while not directly involved in film, certainly helped to parody them for decades as one of the main artists at Mad Magazine, where he drew their famous fold-in back covers. Mad Magazine, of course, was an inspiration for a generation of comedians, and Jaffe, one of the pioneers behind it. Also from the animation world, I wanted to recognize Leo D. Sullivan, who is an animator on multiple animated TV shows, including Fat Albert, Transformers, My Little Pony, Animaniacs, Tiny Toon Adventures, and various Super Friends series. He also animated the train that was seen at the beginning of Soul Train for decades. Leo D. Sullivan was also a teacher. He devoted part of his life to teaching animation and to helping young black kids get into the world of animation through his own foundation, as well as supporting projects that taught black history. Also in the world of art is Norman Reynolds, a 6-time Oscar-nominated art director and production designer, and a 2-time Oscar winner for a couple of movies you might have heard of called Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Norman Reynolds' job was to make the fantastic real, to take a piece of concept art or something that is written on the page and realize it fully, whether that's the Emperor's throne room or an ancient tomb. People see things like art director and production designer, and they don't really know exactly what that is. is. And Norman Reynolds' job was basically to read in the script of Raiders of the Lost Ark that a giant boulder is going to chase Indiana Jones, and then to work with the art department, to work with the concept artists, to actually get that thing designed and made. He was in charge of that entire department. He was in charge of the look of Star Wars. Norman Reynolds had a huge influence on the movies that you saw. As a matter of fact, Steven Spielberg once described Norman Reynolds as the creative core of the Star Wars trilogy, as well as Raiders of the Lost Ark. He worked on Star Wars, the first 2 Superman films, which were shot back-to-back, as art director. He was then production designer on The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Alien 3, and Mission Impossible, among other films. There were also 2 people in the world of cinematography that I wanted to recognize. The first is Jacques Haitkin, who was the cinematographer for Wes Craven's original Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, as well as its first sequel, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. He was also the cinematographer for B-horror films like Shocker and Wishmaster, and later a second unit director of photography or action photographer for multiple films in the Fast and Furious and MCU franchises. Second unit would be the unit that splits off from the main unit, which is usually working with the actors. The second unit is usually doing pickups or action sequences, things where you don't have to give direct acting motivation. And it basically means that the directors don't have to supervise every single shot in a movie. Some movies have 2 or 3 or 4 units running simultaneously. So that's a pretty important job. And when you have somebody who shot the original Nightmare on Elm Street doing your second unit, that means that your second unit is pretty important. Another cinematographer that I wanted to recognize, a legend who passed away at over 100 years old, is Bill Butler. He was an Oscar nominee for Best Cinematography, a shared nomination for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but it is crazy that he wasn't nominated for more, because here is a small number of the other films that he was the cinematographer for: Frailty, Hot Shots, the original Child's Play, Rockies 2 through 4, Stripes, Grease, The Conversation, and my favorite movie of all time, Jaws. All of those shots that you remember from Jaws, that's Bill Butler behind the camera and that hellish production, one of the last true living legends of the new Hollywood golden age. There are so many great films that he shot. I mean, look at The Conversation and the way that that's shot versus the way that Grease is shot. That's real versatility, and Bill Butler knew how to shoot the hell out of any movie that you put in front of him. And it's sad to see all of these great collaborators. I mean, Steven Spielberg has been losing collaborators left and right just in the last few weeks, and I feel like most people don't even notice that they're gone, or they overlook the obituary notices, and most of them don't even make mainstream media publications. I see this stuff through the trades because they track the Hollywood entertainment industry. Most movie fans don't understand that the people behind all of these classic films, film moments and sets and shots, they deserve recognition just as much as the actors and the directors who do make the headlines when they pass away. So that's one reason that I do this part of the show, because I just want to help people appreciate the work that these artists do, and the fact that outside of the film fan circles, they're usually not even recognized for that work. So for all of these artists, and of course many of the other ones that I will recognize in the future or that I haven't had time to recognize in the past, I recognize their work, and I hope that even more people in the future will remember and recognize that work. And as always, my thoughts go out to each and every one of them and their friends, family, and fans. So before we wrap up, I want to do our box office flashback, which basically takes a look at a weekend in box office history. And we're going to go back 35 years, it's hard to believe, to the weekend of April 1st through the 3rd, 1988, which was the 14th week at the box office, like we just recapped. It fell a little bit earlier in the calendar that year. And that was the opening of Beetlejuice. You look at Beetlejuice, you think, oh, that movie probably opened sometime around Halloween. It did not. It opened smack in the middle of April, or I guess at the beginning of April. An $8 million opening for Beetlejuice, now one of the classic horror comedies of all time. In second place in week 2 was the film Biloxi Blues, starring Matthew Broderick, and also coincidentally with cinematography by Bill Butler, who we were just talking about. $6 million in that sophomore frame for a 15.2% drop. In third place was the Michael J. Fox Big Dramatic Turn in Bright Lights, Big City. It debuted in third place with $5.1 million. The Fox and the Hound, Disney's animated classic, re-released in 1988 in its second week, a 16.7% drop for a total just over $4 million. And in 5th place, the early Demi Moore film, The Seventh Sign, debuting with $3.7 million. But of course, you know what we do. I didn't have time to do it with a lot of the Mario charts, but I will always have time to do it here. We adjust for inflation. And when you push that inflation button to see what these movies would look like in today's dollars, Beetlejuice's debut was right up there around $20.4 million. Not bad for an original comedy. Biloxi Blues' second weekend coming in around $15.2 million, with Bright Lights Big City at just over $13 million, The Fox and the Hound at $10.2 million, and The Seventh Sign at $9.5 million. And that does it for this week on Charts with Dan. I bet you didn't even notice that the streaming charts weren't there. God, this show would have been so long. So you will see streaming charts here on the channel later this week, along with a review of Renfield and some other stuff if I can. I'll be traveling a little bit, which kind of hampers my ability. But you know what I do? You're going to see some hotel room backdrops in the next few days because this channel does keep rolling even when I'm not at my home studio. There are also a lot of options for you this upcoming week and weekend, depending on what you want to see at home or at the movie theater. Opening tomorrow on Wednesday is the Fathom event, Beautiful Disaster, starring Dylan Sprouse and Virginia Gardner, an adaptation of the popular book. So it's not doing the wide release, it's going with the more targeted Fathom event that's really worked before with things like the After films. Moving on to Friday, the Dracula riff Renfield, starring Nicholas Hoult and Nicolas Cage, will be opening in wide release. I'm really excited for this movie and I can't wait to see it and bring you my thoughts on it here on the channel. This is one of my favorite titles. We've talked about it before, The Pope's Exorcist, starring Russell Crowe. It opens in wide release here domestically this Friday, as well as Sweetwater, which is about the NBA star Nat Sweetwater Clifton and the integration of the NBA several decades ago. Also opening in wide release is the Toni Collette comedy Mafia Mama. She plays a woman who inherits a mafia family. It comes from director Catherine Hardwicke, so you can check that out. In limited release from Crunchyroll is the anime film Suzume. It is a global sensation, one of the highest grossing anime films ever, from director Makoto Shinkai, who brought you Weathering with You and Your Name. I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to see it this weekend, but I'm going to definitely see it as soon as I can because I've been looking forward to this movie for a very long time. Opening in limited release, just a few of the films that you could catch are Rare Objects, which is written by, directed by, and starring Katie Holmes. I really just feel like my Dawson's Creek fandom from back in the day required me to plug that movie. Sakura is also opening limited release. This is starring and co-directed by Donnie Yen. It's his first time behind the camera as director in nearly 2 decades. Also opening in limited release ahead of a premiere on Disney Plus next month is the documentary Wildlife from the directors of Free Solo about conservationist Chris Tompkins and her husband Doug. And streaming on Netflix this weekend, starting on Friday, is the film The Last Kingdom, Seven Kings Must Die, which is a wrap-up to the multi-season BBC/Netflix original series, The Last Kingdom. You can catch all that and more at home and on streaming. And of course, I'll be back here next week to recap all of that. Thank you so much to everybody for sticking around this supersized version of Charts as we talked about things like the Super Mario Bros. Movie. I'll be back next week to talk about week 2 of the Super Mario Bros. Movie, as well as things like the Indie Theater Spotlight. I didn't forget about it. It's just been a couple of really packed shows these last couple of weeks, but I already know who I'm going to be talking about next week. And I'm excited to bring that Indie Theater to you, as well as just, whatever crosses my mind. I like doing this show. I will see you back here for streaming charts later this week, and then from the road for my review of Renfield and maybe another video or two. Thanks for your time. Until next time, please stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.